You ever walk into the shop, look at a flat sheet of 16 gauge galvanized, and feel like you're staring at a riddle that hasn't been written yet?
Honestly, Tiger, I usually just see a giant silver wafer that's waiting to slice my shins open if I carry it wrong.
Well, there is that, the bite of the dragon. But truly, there's a specific kind of magic in taking something that's as two-dimensional as a pancake and coaxing it into a three-dimensional conductor head or a complex offset for a roof drain. It's like origami, but with more sparks and a lot more swearing when the math doesn't square up.
Today, we're diving into the Old Testament of metalwork, sheet metal layout, and pattern development. And I have to say, looking at some of these vintage manuals you pulled from 1910, the geometry looks less like shop class and more like summoning an ancient deity.
It's the art of the unroll. If you can't see the shape flattened out in your mind's eye before you ever touch the snips, you're just making expensive scrap metal. I remember the first time I tried to build a compound twisted elbow for a square leader, one of those jobs where the pipe has to dive down and turn 30 degrees at the same time. I spent 4 hours cutting test pieces that looked like crumpled soda cans. I was basically trying to wing it, and the metal doesn't like to wing it. It demands a plan.
So, for the folks who aren't looking at a CAD screen, where does a layout actually begin? Because when I see those parallel line or radial line terms, my brain starts to itch.
Think of it as 3 different languages. Parallel line development is your bread and butter. It's for things like standard elbows or T-joints, shapes where the sides stay parallel. You're essentially just stretching the perimeter out into a straight line.
Like unfolding a soup can label?
Exactly. But if that can is tapered like a funnel or a conical gutter outlet, now you're talking radial line. You need a pivot point. You're drawing arcs from a single apex. If you try to use parallel logic on a cone, your seams will never meet. They'll be looking at each other from across the room like ex-spouses at a wedding.
And then there's triangulation. That's the big boss level, right?
Triangulation is what you use when the shape is truly irregular, like a square duct transitioning into a round pipe. You break the surface down into a series of triangles, because a triangle is the only shape that's rigid. Its dimensions define its angles. If you know the lengths of the 3 sides, that shape can only exist one way. It's the heavy lifter of the layout world.
You mentioned that 1910 manual, Practical Sheet Metal Work. It talks a lot about leader heads and gusset sheets. It feels very architectural. Does this stuff still apply in a world of CNC plasma cutters?
More than ever, a CNC is just a fast way to cut a bad pattern if the operator doesn't understand the bend allowance. You see, when you fold metal, the outside of the bend stretches and the inside compresses. There's a neutral axis in the middle that stays the same. If you don't account for that tiny bit of grow in the material, your 4-inch box ends up 4 1/8, and suddenly the lid won't fit.
Is this where you tell me about the time you built a whole set of octagonal conductor heads that were all slightly off?
Oh, it was worse than that. I was doing a restoration on a Victorian-style copper gutter system. I had these beautiful, ornate patterns laid out. I was so proud of the geometry. I cut the copper, which, mind you, wasn't cheap even back then, and I forgot to include the laps for the seams.
No.
Yes. I had essentially created a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces were exactly the right size to touch each other, but nothing could actually be joined. I had no meat to solder. I sat there looking at those pieces for an hour, just wondering if I could somehow convince the client that butt-jointed copper with no solder was a new architectural trend.
That brings up a good point. These old books talk a lot about allowing laps. It's not just the shape, it's the connection.
Right, you have to decide, is this a lap seam, a wired edge, or a Pittsburgh lock? Each one requires a different amount of extra material added to your pattern. A wired edge, where you fold the metal around a stiffening wire, takes about 2.5 times the diameter of the wire. If you don't bake that into your layout, you're starving the project of the very thing that makes it strong.
Let's talk tools for a second. In that NYC CNC video we were looking at, they were doing a manual layout for a bolt hole pattern. No lasers, just a center punch and dividers.
That's where the truth lives. A pair of dividers is the most honest tool in the shop. If you're laying out a circle or stepping off equal spaces for rivets on a leader pipe, those dividers don't lie. But you have to have a steady hand and a sharp eye, as the old timer said. If your center punch mark is off by the thickness of a fingernail at the start, by the time you walk those dividers around a large circumference, that error has grown into a gaping canyon.
I noticed they used a specific marking fluid on galvanized iron. I've tried using a Sharpie and disappears into the gray.
Yeah, galvanized is tricky because of the zinc coating. The old books suggest a marking fluid, usually a mix of copper sulfate and water, that actually etches the line into the metal so it stays visible while you're working. These days, most guys use a layout dye like Dykem. It's that deep blue or red stain. It makes your scribe lines pop like a neon sign.
What about the material itself? We see everything from 6061 aluminum to stainless steel in the modern guides. Does the layout logic change?
The math stays the same, but the physics of the fold changes. Aluminum is a bit of a diva. It has a grain. If you bend it the wrong way against the grain, it'll crack on you like a dry cracker. Stainless is the opposite. It's stubborn. It has spring back. You bend it to 90 degrees, and it tries to jump back to 88 the second you release the pressure. You have to overbend it, which means your layout needs to be precise enough to handle the tension.
So, if I'm a beginner wanting to try a pattern for a spout or a rainwater cutoff like in the books, what's the first hurdle?
Drawing the elevation and the plan view. You can't just draw the flat shape first. You have to draw the object as it looks when it's finished, from the side and from the top. Then, you use projection lines to carry the dimensions over to your pattern. It's a conversation between the 3D world and the 2D world.
It sounds like descriptive geometry.
It is. It's the geometry of reality. And here's a tip most people overlook. Always make a paper template first. Cardstock is cheap, copper is a mortgage payment. If your paper model doesn't go together with Scotch tape, your metal definitely won't go together with a soldering iron.
I've seen your paper graveyard in the corner of the shop.
Hey, that's my library of lessons. One of those lessons was a 4-piece 90-degree elbow. It's a classic problem. You have to divide the angle into miter lines. If you mess up the angle of the miter cut, the elbow breathes. It doesn't stay a consistent diameter through the turn. It looks choked, like a garden hose with a kink in it.
Speaking of choking, the old 1910 text mentioned thawing frozen conductors and protecting pipes from freezing. It seems like the layout wasn't just about looks, but survival.
Precisely. A corrugated leader pipe isn't just for style. Those ridges give the metal room to expand if the water inside turns to ice. If it were a smooth, rigid pipe, it would split right down the seam. The layout men of a century ago knew that. They were designing for the elements.
We've talked a lot about the headwork. What about the handwork? Once the pattern is cut, how do you keep it square?
You have to trust your notches. When you're cutting out a pattern, you cut little V-shapes where the bends are supposed to be. If your notches are clean and hit exactly on your scribe lines, the metal will almost want to fold itself correctly. But if you're sloppy with the snips, you'll be fighting the metal the whole way.
I've seen you use a soldering trough for long seams. That was in the 1910 book too.
Yeah, a simple wooden V-block to hold the pipe while you run the iron. Some of the best tools are just pieces of scrap wood used cleverly. And that reminds me, never underestimate the receptacle for acid.
That sounds ominous.
It's just for the flux. But in the old days, they'd make a lead-lined box just to hold their soldering acid. Everything was purposeful. Even the way they'd find the center of a circle using a framing square. Just simple, elegant geometric tricks that don't require a battery or a Wi-Fi connection.
Okay, Tiger, let's get to the shop disaster of the week. You hinted at a compound twisted elbow earlier. What really happened?
I was working on a leader for an old courthouse, high stakes. I had the pattern laid out on the floor of the shop because it was so big. I had spent 3 days on the math. I was using the parallel line method, but because it twisted, I had to step off the profile at different rotations.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It was a beautiful nightmare. I finished the layout, cut the metal, and went to the break. I started folding. And about halfway through, I realized I had laid out the twist in the wrong direction.
Oh no.
It was a mirror image of what I needed. It would have fit the building perfectly if the building were inside out. I had built a left-handed part for a right-handed corner. I just sat on my stool and watched the sunset through the shop window for a good 30 minutes. I didn't even pick up a tool. I just accepted that I had been outsmarted by a flat piece of steel.
What did you do?
I went home, had a very large glass of iced tea, and came back the next morning. I took that wrong piece and hung it on the wall. It's still there. It reminds me that measure twice, cut once is only half the battle. You have to visualize once too.
So the takeaway is, don't let the geometry bully you.
Exactly. The geometry is just a map. But you're the one who has to drive the car.
Well, I think I'm ready to try a simple eave trough miter this weekend. Maybe just out of some scrap flashing first.
That's the way. Start with a simple square return miter. Get the feel for how the metal moves. And remember, every piece of scrap is just tuition for your master's degree in the trade.
Just don't ask me to do a compound twisted elbow yet.
Give it a month, you'll be seeing triangles in your sleep. Thanks for joining us in the Tiger Den. Now go out there, grab some snips, and make something that'll last longer than you will.
And maybe wear gloves, for my sake.
Definitely wear gloves. See you next time.